Okay, thank you, Patrick. Welcome, everyone. So, before we jump to the wildlife and unicorns, let's warm up with a lighter topic. Could you tell us something about your background? Where do you come from? How did you grow up?
Yeah, sure. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks again for the invite. My name is Andrej Kiska. Those of you who are looking for the Slovak ex-president, I'm sorry he's not coming. I'm just his son. So, if you're looking for the other one, I think he's here actually tomorrow. I come from a humble, village called Poprad from Slovakia, where I grew up. Spent there my 15 years. I went to a German gymnasium. I didn't like German much, so then I went for an exchange program to the US. It's not really an exchange program. It's not like anybody from the US in exchange came to Poprad, but that's what they call it. So studied there for a year. I didn't like it, but for some reason I came back for college and then sort of got enamored in the world of startups and wanted to pursue a career in that. And I tried my best to do it, and I still hope that one day I'll actually be good at it.
Cool. Let's try to go a little bit deeper. What did you want to do as a kid? What is your dream job? I guess it was not, becoming a VC right from the beginning.
Not quite. So I grew up in the 90s, and so my dad was a businessman, which, in English, the word doesn't give it justice, but back in the 90s, you all remember that there was no startup guy. There was a podnikatel. So I wanted to be a podnikatel, not a startup guy, right? So I would carry the big leather suitcase, and then later the second suitcase for the phone and all of that.
I guess the word would be like a hustler or something.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. Well, podnikanie in the 90s was very much a hustle. So yes, you can call it that I wanted to be a full-time hustler, yes.
Okay, have you thought about staying abroad after the university, or why did you come back?
So I did. I had big plans, and then the crisis happened. So I graduated. So I studied finance in college. I studied in the University of Virginia, and so everybody went to Wall Street, and so I was interviewing for this company called Lehman Brothers. So Lehman Brothers. So like I was emailing with them, and they're like, "Hey, let's put this on a break for a couple of weeks." And then I read the article that Lehman went bust. So it wasn't a particularly great time to start in finance, and I knew that I had to swim against the shore to actually find a job anywhere in finance. And so I thought, well, everybody's trying to go to Wall Street from my school, so why don't I try going somewhere else? And the natural place was Central Europe. And so my friend was doing a dissertation thesis on private equity in Czech Republic and Slovakia, and she had a Excel spreadsheet with the names of the partners she interviewed for the dissertation thesis. So I took those names and the email addresses, and I sent my resume to each of them. And there were 15 names. 10 wouldn't reply. 2 told me I'm crazy, and 3 took me to an interview, and that's how I landed my first job.
That's a pretty good hit rate, I would say.
I'm happy there was no 0.
Okay, and what kind of student were you in high school or university? Were you like, the all A's guy, or studying a lot,
right.
or a lot of extracurricular activities?
If I was a student today, I would end up playing Counter-Strike. That was my thing. But back 15 years ago, you had to go to a cafeteria. I don't know how many you remember, LAN parties. You had to go to an internet cafe. You would hook up, your computer next to 4 others, and you would play Counter-Strike. So, we typically would skip, I think, physics to do that, because that was the last period on Tuesdays and Thursdays or something like that. So that tells you what kind of student I was. I did just enough to get by, and I was lucky in that, through some hacks, I ended up, when I came back from the US from the exchange program, I went to an English-speaking high school where the worst grade you could get is a B. If you get worse than that, they let you retake the test. So, if you ever want to put your kids through an easy high school, it was called Quality School International, and I loved it. And they also had an international baccalaureate program with it. So, the worst you could do is a B. And the great thing about the American universities was that they look at your grade point average. and they don't know anything about us not being able to get a worse grade than a B. So they saw that I'm taking all these international baccalaureate classes, and the worst they ever gotten was a B, and they're like, oh, this guy must be good. So that's how I ended up getting to college, and so Virginia at the time, I had a pretty good undergraduate business school. It was a state school, which means it was cheaper, and I was a skier, but not a very good one. So I had to look for schools that were hopefully good academically, and at the same time had a ski program that wasn't too good because I wouldn't get in, but also like had non-existent program because there would be no way for me to pay college. And so Virginia was right in the middle. It was the most southern school with a ski program that actually paid some skiers to ski for it. And so I was just good enough to get in there, so that sort of helped pay for that, and that's how I ended up at UVA.
Cool. Do you recall any particular classes that, that you remember, like, oh, this was really good, that gave you some edge in the future?
Yeah, absolutely, like the entire program. So, you also asked, like, what kind of student I was. So I will answer those two questions, I guess, now. Like, there was definitely a moment, and so, when I have two kids, and I'm thinking sort of hard about education and what kind of educations I want them to go through. And UVA was great in that, I very much took my Slovak approach to academics. I don't think I played Counter-Strike by then. I think there were better games than that, but I definitely, was trying to put in just enough to get by. And so the thing about the business program in that school was that you first get into the school, you study for 2 years whatever you want, and then you have to apply to the business school your third year. And the grade point average was a 3.6 to get into the business school on average, which is like a A-. And mine, after my first semester, was a 3.1. And I had 2 more semesters before they take applications, which statistically speaking meant that I had to get straight A's the next 2 semesters, otherwise I would not be getting in. And so there was like a particular moment which was a wake-up call for me saying, okay, my parents are helping me pay for this college. Like, I'm here in the US. Like, I might as well finally like actually try to make something out of it. And started studying Fridays, Saturdays, and that was like definitely a career-defining moment for me. In that if I continued my old ways, like I'm not sure I would get into the school, the business school of UVA. And thanks to the business school of UVA, there were courses that were able to teach me how to land a job at Benson Oak, which was actually designed for people who were 2 to 3 years into their private equity job already. So I had a couple of courses. The great thing about Anglo-Saxon education is that they grade primarily on what you say at the end of the day. And so UVA school was known to apply the Harvard business case studies to the undergraduate students, which basically meant you were given a case study. They told you, okay, study it at home, then come here, we are going to talk about it, and we are going to grade you at the same time, and we'll tell you what grade you are getting based on what you say. The best class on that was called Critical Thinking on Business Issues. You were either getting a business case or we had to read 1 book a week. I always loved reading books, so this was a great course for me, and all we did was debate, so there was very little homework aside from reading, which I loved. And that really allowed me to then go to Benson Oak, and they gave me a case study, and the partner pulled me aside, and he's like, you never had a private equity job before? I'm like, no, I just took some courses and, did some case studies. And so the second guy competing for that job was 3 years in a private equity fund, and I think I landed the job especially thanks to that school. So when I had a chance to support the school back in the form of an advisory board, it was the first thing I did. And I totally understand why Americans actually pay back to the school, try to contribute financially, try to contribute with their time, because we do come out of that school thinking that it really gave us a boost in our career early on.
Yeah, that's really nice. Actually, most of the most successful global VCs, come from, they have their own business, build some technology company, sell it, and then they kind of raise a fund and start investing. Have you ever been on the other side? I mean, did you have your own business, maybe still as a student, or?
Yeah, I don't think that's true. The most successful fund in the world is Benchmark, and Benchmark's managing partner is Bill Gurley, who was always an investment banker and actually turned VC. So the answer to the question, Credo has no operator on the team. Like, all 4 GPs never started a big global startup before. And so it's kind of a controversial thing, but when you look at operator-led businesses, there was a trend in the 70s when this was true, because your VC in the US in the 70s was actually an incubator, right? So like when Tom Perkins was investing out of Kleiner Perkins, their most successful startup was actually the one that Tom Perkins invented, which was a laser company. And then Andreessen Horowitz came around 2009 and 10. And so Mark and Ben sort of like made this big PR play that, like it's sort of for founders by founders. And it helped them sort of break into the big leagues, even though, their returns just came out and turned pretty mediocre. But what people don't realize is that Mark and Ben, in between themselves, had over 100 angel investments before starting Andreessen Horowitz. So I think the notion that for some reason, if you start a company, you will be a good investor into other companies, I think is totally false. Like if you break it down into, let's say you started a company. Let's say you started an e-commerce business, which is successful in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The problem with that is, okay, so you exit that company, and so how do you apply that knowledge to something else? Like if you want to invest in something else than e-commerce, you don't know anything else about those verticals. And more dangerously still, especially in Central European conditions, you think that because you sold the business, you already know everything there is about building a business, and you have a tendency to tell other founders what to do based on your experience, even though your experience is totally unrelated to the problems that the founder is facing. So in many ways, I actually view founding a business before investing as a disadvantage. It's a disadvantage because you're trying to project what made you successful into the hopeful success of others. And the truth is that there are 1,000 different ways how to succeed, not one. And if you actually never started a business, you don't have that bias coming in. So I think there is very little you can take away from operating experience that actually is applicable to investing experience. I think as an investor, you have to have a different skill set than an operator. With that being said, the one big strength which a lot of American VCs who have been operators do say is that you show more empathy towards the founder struggles. Like because you have been there, because you have been close to a failure, you know what it is like to fail. And that level of empathy can be helpful in tough times for a startup. Luckily, we consider Credo Ventures also a startup, and we were also pretty close to failure. So I can totally relate to the sense of failing.
Okay, can you recall your first investment when you got to Credo, and this was the thing that you took from the very beginning until you actually deployed the cash? And how did it turn out?
Yeah, it turned out horrible. And like the great thing about a partnership is that your partners prevent you from succumbing to your worst instincts. In that everybody has a blind spot. You tend to fall in love with a founder. And so the risk of venture investing is that there's a lot of research in psychology in that you judge the people you see in the first 5 or 10 seconds when you meet them based on the body language, how they look whatsoever. And then the rest of the meeting, you basically are bending the evidence of whatever they tell you to fit that image you build in the first 5 to 10 seconds when you met that person. And so the advantage of having a partnership is that they are able to sort of hold you against those biases because they might have a different impression. They might not have met the founder and therefore have a more objective view of the business than you could. So when I joined Credo 2011, to actually give you an answer to the question, I think I sourced the first deal 2012 or 13, and that deal is in our books for a big fat zero.
How long did it survive since the investment?
All right, so there are a couple. So the short answer to that is it's still alive, and you never know. It can still turn around, and so it's a bootstrap business. We just value our stake at zero. But the interesting thing about venture business, which is counterintuitive, is that there's a lot of data that shows that the funds who have a higher failure rate also have a higher success rate. So your goal is not for every investment to return capital. This is not sort of private equity world. But actually, the more write-offs you make, it's a good benchmark for how much of a risk you take. And so venture business is the game of outliers, right? Like, UiPath will drive 90% of our economics of the second fund. But in order to get to an outlier, you typically have to take big risk at the beginning. And it has to be a counterintuitive investment, which many people don't believe. And by the default of that, many of your startups are not supposed to make it. and therefore they will fail. So we are in the business of writing off 50% of our investments. That's what we should do. That's what our model assumes. And therefore, the ambition to not have write-offs, I think, in the venture world, perhaps perversely, is wrong. Because if you play too safe, you are not going to have an outlier. That's the basic logic.
Okay. Now, so you have been around at the Czech or the CEE startup scene for quite a while now. How do you see it evolving from the very beginning when you jumped right in to today? At the beginning, Credo was like the pioneer, one of the first investors. Now you have so many funds, family offices, angel investors, accelerators. It's a whole different world. Is it better? Is it worse?
From a returns perspective, much better. I always compare a startup ecosystem to a snowball. In that, so we invest in 8 countries of what we call Central and Southeastern Europe, out of which we consider Czech Republic the most mature. And when people ask me why is that, my answer to that is that the maturity of an ecosystem is the function of its previous success stories. So good data was a big driver of the early activity of the Czech ecosystem, because as those people who are first or founding employees in those startups leave those startups as the startup scales, they tend to start their own companies. And there was a generation of Roman Staněk's employees who learned how to build a big global business under his hands, who left the company and went on to start their own business. So, the first and second engineers of Good Data were the founders of API, which was sold to Oracle, which was an investment in our first fund. His head of product, Hubert Palan, is now the CEO of Product Board, which is also a very successful Czech startup. And so Czechs, for whatever reason, just had a good head start in terms of the success stories, global success stories they were able to produce in the 90s and in the 2000s, which gave us a head start and produced a more experienced and sophisticated generation of company builders in the 2010 era.
So would you say that the quality of the leads that you see nowadays is better compared to the past?
Absolutely. Like there are guys in the Prague today who fly to Silicon Valley, raise $2 million from tier 1 investors, and fly back and continue building their business from the Czech Republic. Like that did not happen 5 or 7 years ago. There are guys who, go to YC, come out of YC and raise money from a bunch of tier 1 investors today. That did not happen 5 to 7 years ago. So when you look at competitive landscape of Credo Ventures, like you say, there are a lot of funds and a lot of accelerators and this and that. Our biggest competitor is not a local fund. Our biggest competitor is Y Combinator and Sequoia, because the best founders now can raise and go there.
Okay. And how would you compare the Czech ecosystem to other countries in CE, or that to Western Europe or the US?
So I think the great thing about being an entrepreneur in Central Europe is that it's much better to be an entrepreneur, a technology entrepreneur with global ambitions in the Czech Republic than Germany or France. We have one underlying asset that nobody else in the world has. Like when you look at HackerRanks or any other Olympics for developers, for whatever reason, and I think we have Soviets to thank for this ironically, we have the best technical talent in the world. And you combine that with our small domestic economy, and I think a lot of technical people today arrive at the conclusion that if they want to build a business, and if they want to build a big business, it's actually easier to build a big business if you go after a global market opportunity than a local one. So I think in many ways, especially to our small economies and our great tech talent, make us much more likely to produce more UiPaths than a France or a Germany, which has an average tech talent pool and an average size economy. So you are comfortable enough to build a business in Germany, which will have SMB-like aspects. It will never be a big breakout story. But I don't think Central Europeans are like that. I think Central Europeans have much more of an Israel or Sweden potential, which means, going after the big markets, going global, than the one of Germany or France. And how the Czechs compare to the other CE markets, as I said, I think it's the most sophisticated market. I think there's a lot of activity in Poland, but Poland suffers through some of the same symptoms as Germany or France. So the market's bigger, so it's easy to be more comfortable in the domestic market versus the Czechs and Slovaks, which I think have a bigger push to go abroad.
Okay, and so you invest in a company. what's the life, what's the routine, how involved are you with the companies, and is there any correlation, that the more involved you are with someone, the better they perform, or is it the opposite?
There's a Mike Tyson quote that you always have a plan until you get punched in the face. And that's sort of what the budget of a startup looks like before they get an investment and after they get it. So a typical trajectory is you promise the investors, the world, and then they get the investment, and your first month, you go down to shit.
And then you go in the ring and punch them.
Yeah, no, then you go in the ring and get punched in the face. What typically happens is some build a budget, some don't even have a presentation. But when we invest, typically things get bad. And then we actually work on making a realistic plan and building the startup from scratch. So every startup at some point goes through an S curve. The S curve of, you are looking for a product market fit. At some point you get it. You start scaling, then you start flattening out. Then you have to find something else and pivot a little bit. And so most startups don't make it part of the initial curve, which is the initial product market fit. But I would say that most of our work in the early days is calming the entrepreneur down. Everybody started much harder than they expected. Avoiding founder fights, which means most of the failures we see at the seed stage is actually the founders not getting along, or the startup just doesn't get product market fit, which means that they run out of cash at some point. So our role always is, keep the company financed. And make sure that people don't fight too much, and hopefully sooner or later they will crack a product market fit. I would say that's where a lot of our early work revolves around.
Okay, now slowly getting to actually finding the unicorns. Is there any channel that worked the best for you in the past? Hackathons, networking events,
sourcing deals.
Yes, yeah. What is the best channel?
Founder recommendations. So our advantage of being on the market for so long and behaving like a good guy is that founders tend to recommend us to work with others. And if I work with a smart founder and that smart founder makes an introduction, is the most valuable source of pipeline for me. So, I don't think I invested into a business plan that I didn't know the founder, or the founder wasn't recommended to me by my fellow founder, for a couple of years at least, which is not true for the whole team of Credo, but for me at least, for some reason this has been the case that, by today, by virtue of the market of having 50 portfolio companies, which means over 100 founders, there's a good chance that they speak to the other founders who are good. And our goal is to be helpful enough where our founders will always say Credo was the most useful seed investor we had, and therefore if you are looking for a seed investor, it should be Credo. That's the motto by which we try to live for our entrepreneurs, and it's actually the motto that sources the most pipeline for us.
Okay, and then I think 3 years ago you moved to Menlo Park. High concentration of unicorns there. What was the experience like? Any lessons learned that you are now bringing back?
Oh boy, bunch of lessons learned. I don't even know where to start. I will start by saying it's hard. It was the hardest thing I have done professionally in my very short professional career. It was also by far the most expensive. So our son was born in the U.S. And so Czechs and Slovaks are complainers, right, on average. And so you typically complain until you go somewhere else, and then you realize how good you actually have it at home. So about the question on education, if I had unlimited pool of money, I would encourage everybody to go for a year or two to whatever they claim is their promised land. Some call it Russia, some call it US, some say it's China. Whatever it is, spend there 2 years and then come back and benchmark what you expected versus the actual reality. So, a lot of people say our healthcare sucks, it's horrible, you have to wait long lines. So my wife gave birth to our son in Stanford Hospital. And, we didn't have to wait for a line. It was nice. She could order food to her room, 24/7 room service, as opposed to motels, rožok, and ham. But it cost $85,000. So, the service was nicer. We didn't stand in a line. But do I pay $85,000 to give a birth? I don't know. I would reconsider. Or I had to get a CT scan for whatever reason, and I received a bill on my app, and that bill was for $4,200 for a CT scan. And the monthly insurance for the four was $3,500. So things get very expensive very quick, and the performance of what you pay to what you get in terms of the standard of living is actually pretty low. So I think that today we are much more aware of how good do we have it in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and how the land of promise is actually more of a land of marketing promise than anything else. With that all being said, on the business side, it's been incredible. The learning curve of so I was basically like a street salesman of Central European startups on Sandy Hill Road. So I would go from that house to house, Sequoia, Kleiner, and try to explain to everybody how great Central European startups are and how everybody should invest. And it was a great learning in presenting our startups and comparing our investment thesis to what the big boys in Silicon Valley think about that investment thesis. And, most of the time they would tell us that they suck. But then there are those, the beauty of venture is that it will be 1 to 3 companies that make all your returns on a given fund. And the beauty of being in Silicon Valley, if you're lucky enough that your portfolio can succeed in there, is that if they invest a lot of money at a very high valuation. So if your portfolio is good enough, we tend to add a lot of value by providing higher valuations, which means less dilution and more capital, which means bringing more investors on board who have deep experience in whatever vertical those founders operate. So it's a way for us to support the winners. 90% of our startups are never going to raise money in the Valley, and I think we have a better radar for who can and who cannot than 3 years ago. And for those who can, I think it can add tremendous value. It's just not for everybody.
And you had quite a few success stories, exits, or companies that raised a lot of follow-up rounds. What are some of the common features among these successes, or maybe what do you look for, when you see a new company on the radar?
So people underestimate this, but it's all founders. Like seed and Series A, it doesn't matter if you have 10K MRR or 110K MRR or 210K MRR. For them, these are all immaterial numbers. At the end of the day, the founders, the investors who are positive would say, I love Hubert, I love Daniel. They wouldn't say, I love the MRR or I love the product, maybe as a second or third thing. But at the end of the day, what they mostly look for is, does the team have what it takes to succeed on sort of a global level? And there are many ways to analyze this. But what I think we are honing on more and more is sort of the founder-centric investing, meaning not only are we trying to be supportful of the founders, but we have a better idea of what kind of founder, at least the Silicon Valley guys, think can build a global business, which is not necessarily always true. I would say the beauty of UiPath for all of Central European founders is Daniel Dinesh was, just a regular boy from Bucharest who came to us. I hope he's going to excuse me when I say this, even though I'm sure he's never going to see my presentation. But he, when we saw him, we were like, wow, is this going to be the CEO of a big business one day? Or will he need, another CEO or at least a strong COO? And 4 years later, he built the fastest growing enterprise software company in the history of enterprise software, right? Like, that's a big deal. It came out of Romania, out of all places. It didn't come from China. It didn't come from the US. And if he can do it, I think anybody from Central Europe can do it. And we were lucky enough that I came to the US at the time when UiPath and Product Board and Supernova and all these guys who are now there were raising those initial rounds. And we were able to help them and support them on the journey by making those introductions and getting good follow-on investors on board. And if they can do it, then there is no reason other founders from Central Europe cannot do it. I would actually argue that the odds are higher from a Central European to build a bigger business than an American building a similarly big business. UiPath, when they were raising their Series A, had 30% of the revenue from the US, 30% of the revenue from Europe, 30% of the revenue from Asia. If you look at the DNA of an American startup, 100% of the revenue would come from the US. If you look at the DNA of a German startup, 80% of it is going to come from Germany. by having the muscle of international expansion early, if you have a strong product market fit, it's much easier to scale in the Series B and C beyond because you already know how to expand abroad. An American enterprise software startup will raise this Series C by only sitting in the US and at some point thinking, okay, what can I do internationally? But by then you already have a bunch of international competition. So I think there are some unique aspects why we can actually build much better kick-ass global businesses than not only Western Europeans, but Americans can.
And what are some of the mistakes or the simple fixes that could be done that some of the companies from CE or from the region could have been much more successful?
So many mistakes. So not that many fixes. Look, like I spend a bit more time at home now. By home, I guess I'm in Central Europe. And I was telling you this, but so we moved my family back to Prague when I'll have to tell the story of how my wife told me one day that she's taking the kids home and I have the option of staying in the US or joining them. So I was provided the illusion of choice and we moved back. And so here we are. And in all fairness, my wife had a much harder job in Silicon Valley than I had. Stuck with 2 kids at home, our visa didn't allow her to work. Everything being super expensive, so you watched everything you bought or rented. Not having your family close, trying to raise the 2 kids like halfway across from the world, while me meeting interesting people, going to Sequoia and Kleiner and this and that. It was totally an asymmetric thing to do. So, this is sort of a big thank you to my wife for being patient with me and supporting me on this crazy journey. And so we have our family here, so I spend over 50% of my time here. And when I review today a lot of Central European businesses, the main thing that they suffer from is that they develop their products and teams in isolation from the biggest customers. Because that's our real disadvantage, right? Like the American building a startup in Silicon Valley, especially in the world of enterprise software, from day one has access to the biggest customers. We, on the other hand, sort of make assumptions with what can a big customer need or want. And we typically make the mistake of equating the problems and needs of a Czech customer to the problems and needs of a much bigger customer abroad. So my first response to a founder wanting to start a business with not having that much experience in the market he is in is go and speak to the largest customers who should be buying your product 2 or 3 years down the road and learn what is the actual problem they are facing and make sure your solution actually delivers on that problem in a unique way, right? Most of our startups start here, try to have first customers here and then expand abroad, and I think that's tough. So increasingly, we are in the business of investing 90% enterprise software, which means we tell our founders, all right, you can raise first money from us and off you go to the Valley and we'll do everything we can to support you there, and you will keep your engineering teams back at home, and we sort of create these dual DNA companies. And that's what has been successful for us, like exposing the founders very early in the company life cycle to the biggest customers and seeing if they can make it or not.
Okay, that makes sense. What about, so you talked about how does a good company look like, what are the mistakes? Do you have an anti-portfolio, companies that you passed on and turned out to be big winners?
Yeah, so I spent my second year in the US fundraising for our fund, which, like, if you think fundraising for a startup is hard, try to fundraise for a venture fund from Prague in Silicon Valley, trying to explain why, like these funds, venture capitalists at least are paid to invest in startups. Investors into venture capital in the US are paid not to invest in a new fund, right? They are big college endowments, big pension funds that already have their 10 venture relationships, and they will tell you, well, look, I am already in Sequoia or Benchmark, so tell me, why should I invest in Credo? And the answer to that is not always easy. It's actually pretty hard. And they will tell you, look, I might make one new relationship a year per 2, and I will see 500 VC funds for that one investment I will make. So it's pretty hard to break into that club. And the analogy I started with this was going to answer your question, which I forgot in the meantime.
The anti-portfolio.
And they ask, why invest in Prague? And the problem with that is that you need to show a lot of success stories. So I wish I had a bigger anti-portfolio of like big billion-dollar businesses, because the biggest problem we face as an ecosystem in the eyes of Silicon Valley is not enough success stories. So our anti-portfolio, I love the Muse guys. So if I was to go local with Czechs, Muse have a fantastic founding team, very strong founder market fit, raise a bunch of money, and I'm crossing my fingers that they are successful in the US, and all the success they have had so far is well deserved. If I said Kiwi, I would be boring, because I guess everybody says Kiwi. So I think that's another big one, and I'm sure there are a bunch of others that I'm missing from Czech Republic alone, which I'm not really covering from our partnership. But yeah, I wish there were many more than that.
Is there any difference actually just between Czechs and Slovaks?
Yeah. For us, the smaller the domestic market, the better. So
it forces you to go out, right?
Yeah. So we, have a new fund I cannot really talk about, but we made like 10 investments out of it, out of which I think a third, maybe even more than a third, are Slovak founders, but none of them live in Slovakia. Some kind of live somewhere between Prague and Silicon Valley. One is in San Diego. One is full-time in Menlo Park. So, increasingly, the most mature founders just start their businesses elsewhere, at least in Slovakia.
Okay, so before we go to the questions from the audience, I'll just have few, so like really quick questions, like 3 seconds per answer. Ready?
3 seconds?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's like one word, okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Prague, San Francisco, or Bratislava?
Prague.
B2B or B2C?
B2B.
Pre-seed or Series A?
Pre-seed.
Halušky, burger, or svíčková?
Halušky.
Deep tech or shallow tech?
Shallow tech.
Growth or profit?
Growth.
And what is your favorite podcast?
Oh, damn, I already missed that. 20-minute VC?
Okay. Who's the moderator? Who is it from?
Harry Stebbings?
Okay.
If you want to learn the dirty secrets of venture capital, watch 20-minute VC. He has recorded 2,900 episodes with venture capitalists and asked them every question possible. So,
cool. Okay, so this will be a longer one. You can breathe now.
Oh, okay. All right.
What book would you recommend? That everybody should read if they want to succeed in the startup world.
This is a hard question because you have a bias to recommend the latest book you read. One book I would recommend everybody to read in today's world is Rational Optimist. It doesn't have anything to do per se with startups, but it has to do with very rationally and empirically explaining why mankind in our existence has always benefited from more and more integration. The closer we cooperate together, the better off everybody is. It actually goes back to explaining why, cities were formed so trade can flourish. And in today's world of isolation, of, increasing nationalism and emotion around it, it's very good to read a book which explains why, if we keep on integrating and sort of living closer together and cooperating more, everybody will be better off. So I think that's a book everybody should read in today's confusing times, startup related or not. And then I guess I will give you 2 books on startups. I'm a son of a politician, so I will never answer the question you ask. I will just answer my own. But the 2 books are, one is High Growth Handbook by Elad Gil. So for those of you who already have some sort of a product market fit and are looking for scaling, I think it's the best book on, how to continue growing and not hitting the flattening curve. And the second one, which I think people underestimate in the early days, and it goes back to why startups fail at the early stage, many times it's the founder disagreements. I would read the book Founder Dilemmas. Like it explains like how to mitigate all of the fallout that comes from fights and troubles on the co-founder level.
So, which Czech or Slovak startup will be the first unicorn?
Oh boy. Okay. Well, I have to say something from our portfolio. I'm clearly biased, but the best funded, and I'm also not supposed to talk too much about all of this. It's not yet public, but the most valuable Czech startup we have in our portfolio will be PriceFX. And they're a bit under the radar, I think. Are not winning Startup of the Year awards because they're started sort of by mature, older executives operating in the world of the unsexy enterprise software, which we love so much. But my prediction is this one is the closest to it right now.
Why? So you have a preference for like B2B. You say always enterprise software. You said that B2B from
That's
the
right.
two.
That's right.
What's the difference? Or why? Why is the preference?
Yeah, so it goes back to the logic of being close to your customer from day one. So if you look at how a B2C business is built in the early days, it takes a lot of iteration with some group of users that hopefully represent a much larger sample. And so there it's a lot about a question of distribution, right? Like, when Jan Koum was starting WhatsApp, they started out in some Ukrainian diaspora of high school somewhere near San Francisco, but it was a small sample, a representative of the entire US market. Like if we are to build a B2C business, like our sample size here back at home is too small to be representative of a big market. At the same time, if you want to build a B2C business and move to the US, like you have to understand their culture, you have to understand the nuances of what the B2C user wants in the US. And I think having a unique insight into a user behavior of a culture you don't know or are not intimately aware of is super hard. In the B2B world, counterintuitively, perhaps, it's easier because it takes the best of what our world can offer. Enterprises have deep technical issues that require robust, sophisticated solutions for which our amazing and cheap technical labor force is best positioned to solve. So I think it's just much easier to break out on the B2B side for our startups because all you need to get from a seed to Series A is one big contract with Cisco. What you need on the B2C side, Allbirds, which is like an American B2C unicorn, had $1 million in revenue the first month they were started in San Francisco, right? So, good luck repeating that out of Prague.
Yeah, and so maybe it comes down to also, how you do sales. I mean, it's maybe much easier to focus on a few single big fishes than, trying to get the millions of small.
For us, it is, right? Because like the beauty of that is if you're selling something at a high price point to a Cisco, you can afford a higher cost of acquisition, which means you can hire that great English-speaking sales guy in the US, who'll be wearing the suit and selling stuff to Cisco later. You don't have that luxury at the B2C side where your cost of acquisition is hopefully zero, right? So you have to have a very creative ideas on how to make the marketing work. So not only is the product execution a little bit easier for our region, but also the distribution is like much easier to comprehend. Well, at the end of the day, I'm just going to hire a great team of American salespeople to help me out.
Right. Okay. Have you ever successfully exited a startup towards another bigger investor while knowing that the startup will not exist 2 years later?
So I think there is an oxymoron in that question in the successful exit and not willing to believe that the startup will exist in 2 years.
I mean, most often you stay in the company, right? When there is a next round. You don't.
Yeah, but this is speaking about an exit, right? So there are a bunch of exits that happen on the acqui-hire level, where you don't buy the startup for the revenue or perhaps not even the product, but you primarily buy the startup for the team and then you as a big buyer develop that product together with that team. So there was a big acqui-hire buying season around 2015 and 16 led by Yahoo, who was trying to get fresh talent on board by acquiring younger startups. I think the bar for that is higher, and I think the bar for that is significantly higher in Central Europe, because for our successful exits, like when Cisco bought Cognitive Security and Oracle bought APRE, they bought it with the vision of actually building out a large product division in Prague and using our team as a core for that. So what they were buying much more is the product behind the team and the team's ability to scale the team further, right? So Cognitive Security, I don't know how many people they have, but it has to be close to 100 out of the original team of 20, right? So like Cisco actually built an entire division on the pillars of the product that CESA had at the beginning. Probably the same will be true for Oracle. So I think that those exits do happen where the startup may not be around, but you certainly hope that the team will build something with the buyer together.
Okay, so next one, why not B2C? I think we touched on this already, or do you want to add something?
Look, so like what? We do have B2C businesses, and for example, travel is one vertical which in the B2C space, for example, when I speak to the benchmark GPs, they say, Europe, I will look at travel any day. Because for whatever reason, travel, because Europe is much more divided than the US, there are more interesting use cases for travel in Europe than there are in the US. We have a great, actually, art business out of Poland that we invested in as well. So we do make those exceptions, but I would say it's 80% or so B2B. And why B2C, hopefully I explain.
Okay, what do you look for in startups? Maybe I would specify this. What do you look for in a founder? Because you said that, it's really about the founder.
So I think the most fundamental question is, why is this founder, what unique insight does this founder have about the particular customer problem which allows him to deliver a better solution than anybody else in the world? And that's what we call founder market fit. Basically, we try to invest in founders who have spent some time in their markets, recognizing some problem which they couldn't find a solution for in the market, and deciding to build that solution themselves. That's what I would define as a founder market fit. I think a lot of people, sort of start with an assumption of a problem, but don't really have its intimate knowledge. And I think we are looking for that intimate knowledge of the product, that unique insight that allows you to build something really unique.
Okay, so maybe like a really passionate, for some problem, for some industry.
Well, passion is one thing, but passion, like some VCs say, passion is good for bet performance, but not for building businesses. So enthusiasm and optimism is good. I don't believe you can be passionate about your business for a decade. I think eventually you run out of passion, but you should be mission driven. And that's why we call it founder market fit. That founder has to fit that particular market and the problem he's solving particularly well.
Okay. Why do you think Estonia has so many successful startups for a country of 1.3 million people? Is it just thanks to the early success of Skype?
Yeah, it is. It's that snowball effect. They just had a much bigger snowball than our good data at the time. It taught a bunch of people how to build businesses from day one. So it's a combination of a super small market and a super high success story. It's the greatest example of why that snowball analogy can work for us in Central Europe as well. We just need to wait for those success stories.
What advice would you give to your 24-year-old self?
Don't try to be someone you are not. Sort of recognize your strengths earlier. Don't try to copy what you believe will make you successful. Try to be authentic. At the end of the day, I am an introvert, so as much as I may enjoy speaking with you, I don't particularly like going to events and social gatherings of any sorts. And I like to spend my time actually one-on-one with the founder discussing a business plan. It's a much better environment for me. And particularly now that we have 2 kids, I try to avoid going to startup events. And of course, Startup Grind is an exception to that as an amazing event. And, I think I suffered a lot going through a bunch of various events early and then, being hungover and the next 2 days at the age of 24. And then I think that retrospectively speaking, I could have spent the time a lot more productively than I had.
That's fair. How do you help your companies with further fundraising?
Well, that was the whole point of moving to the Valley. So, if you have a business that you think can raise money from Sequoia, I can definitely introduce you to Sequoia and almost guarantee they're not going to invest the first time you meet them. But at least I can act as the gate opener. We just had one of the Slovak founders. I sort of organized these roadshows for our portfolio companies. And, I pinged all of the big guys. And in 2 weeks, he's meeting, Andreessen, Kleiner, Benchmark. So we can do that for the founders today, and it's the one thing that I think an investor can really help in for the portfolio that's doing well. At the end of the day, the one thing that can kill a startup is lack of liquidity. If you can get that liquidity from a great investor in the Valley, even better.
Would you invest in a B2C travel startup?
I would, yes. As I said, travel is a sexy vertical that even Benchmark looks at.
At what point do you decide to write off investments? When is the end of the story?
Oh, so the end of the story is not written by us. End of the story is written by the founder. And it's very rare to see a founder, still fighting hard for the business. The lights are on at night and us saying this is not going to work out. Like that doesn't happen. Like when we say, if we put in our books a 0, the founder, there's something went fundamentally wrong. There could have been a fight among the co-founders. The product just hasn't taken off, and we don't quite know why. And we don't know quite what to do about it. So I think by then it's apparent to the founder as well. But even if that happens, and again, I probably should not say this in public, we have this rule where a founder deserves a second chance. So we never sort of tell this to the founder ahead of time, but when times are tough, and they almost always are tough at the seed stage, we have a rule to give one more bridge to the founder. We may think that it's not going anywhere, but at the end of the day, I think every founder deserves a second chance, and we try to provide it from our own funds, even at the times we think economically it's not the right thing to do.
So don't tell anyone, but here's your investor. How big stake you have in UiPath now, if it's not confidential?
It is confidential.
I guess it is. Big enough.
Big enough from returns of the fund's point of view, yes.
Okay. Do successful CEE startups tend to exit or sell too early?
That's a good question. Yes, they do tend to sell too early if they're selling their first business. And this is the one disadvantage that we do have against Silicon Valley. Like, if as a founder you get $5 million, which is 100 million Czech crowns, that's pretty good. You will buy a house, you will get a car, and your kids will live off that. If you get $5 million in Menlo Park, you are not even able to buy a house. So, I think the function, not just of the cost, but particularly, founders like to benchmark against other founders. And the Silicon Valley benefits from the fact that a bunch of founders made it big. If you want to be top 5 founder in Czech Republic, if you sell a business for $50 million, you will probably have a top 5 exit or close to that. If you sell a business in Silicon Valley for $50 million, I think you are top 5 for the current 4 hours or something. So I think that benchmark for founders is just much higher there. And therefore, and this is, I have a vested interest. I invest out of a big fund. I only can call a startup successful if they exit for hundreds of millions of dollars. So I'm disappointed when I see an exit which is lower than that from the big funds. And therefore, I'm more suited and cheering for the higher benchmark. With that being said, I do think that founders, because of that, especially on their first startup, can sell a little too early. And sometimes I wish they would give the startup more chance. But at the end of the day, this is their decision, and I totally respect it.
So would you say that you, as an investor, you never push for the exit too early?
So this is the great thing. Like, bunch of Czech founders. So another thing which is different between Americans and Czechoslovaks is that at some point when you are building a business, you come to an intersection of what is it that you want to maximize. Do you want to maximize control of your startup, or do you want to maximize the value of your startup? Bunch of Czechoslovaks start their business because they want to be their own boss. They don't want to share their equity with employees or investors or anybody else. And I think that this really displays in the maturity of the business. Like, a good founder understands who wants to maximize value. What happened?
I think they disagree. No.
But I'm happy to have a debate on that. But actually, if you look at the index stock options calculator, so Index Ventures, a famous European VC fund, has a calculator which will show you how much equity do people allocate to employees across the world. And it's a benchmark for the maturity of the ecosystem, with the logic being that the more mature the founder, the more he understands that he should give a lot of equity to his employees to get the best people on board. And Central Europe in that regard is on the very last place of what they have on the map. And I think it's a good benchmark for what we call maturity of the ecosystem, which now I forgot what the original question was again. There's the problem of the kids of politicians.
That you if a VC is pushing too early for the exit.
And so the interesting thing that happens is that even though we are control maximizers, and a bunch of our founders said, okay, I will take your money, but I will never sell my startup. And then the first offer to sell that startup comes around, and they say, oh, $5 million? Oh, that's pretty good. And because they realize the journey is much more difficult, everything is much more difficult than they imagined, $5 million is a lot of money at the end of the day. So I don't think we have ever seen that we would be pushing a startup. Actually, in most of the cases, the opposite. Like, a founder gets the first offer and basically jumps on it. We're like, why don't you want to give it one more try? We will give you more money. No, here's my $5 million. I'm great, thank you.
Have they ever listened to, they would pass the first offers and then you get a double? Or do they really take the first offer?
So we definitely have companies that have refused the first offer and now are valued at 10x of what that first offer was.
Okay, that's nice. And related to the exits, I'm curious. So you don't have to specify which company, but return-wise, multiple, what was the highest multiple that you had on any of your exits?
Yeah, so this is tricky. It's don't ever be fooled by the multiples, because at the end of the day, if you invest very little money, you can get great multiple, and it doesn't make any change in your economics. So I think the best way to look at it is what percentage of the fund are you able to return from one investment. UiPath is over 1,000 times our money. But the fund multiple on that would be much more interesting if I could disclose it, but it's in pretty high multiples as well.
But 1,000 is good, as a standalone multiple as well, not just from the,
Yeah, we are not complaining. I think we are pretty happy, and I think that our second fund is top 3 in Europe performance-wise, thanks to that. So yeah, I don't think we can complain. Yeah.
Could you name some of the best VCs in the Czech Republic, or who do you tend to work with? Some new
I heard
faces?
about these Credo guys. I think that they can be pretty good. Who are good VCs?
Do you co-invest with others,
Yeah.
So I work in PE, so, we don't want to share any of our pipeline. You go on your own. But VC is a different story in this regard.
It is. And, so the basic logic is that a company that exits over $100 million on average raises $35 million to get to that exit, which tells you something about how unprofitable that business is, but on average. but it also tells you that we as a fund can only deploy 5 to 7 million per startup. The average ticket they need is 35. So by virtue of that, we know that we are not going to be able to fund this startup on our own. So we are 80 to 90% of our deals are co-investments with other funds. And I think we co-invested with all of the local VCs who were started more than 2 years ago. So, Reflex, and then more recently, Rockaway, I think. Yeah, so Up 21. So I think we worked with all of them, and I think they're all great guys, and we're all trying to, strive for the same goal of building big businesses. So, all of them are pretty good.
So how do your PE experiences inform your VC investment decisions?
How did my PE experience? So that's all right. I wouldn't say I necessarily have. So the Benson Oak guys, when they made the AVG investment, I think it was more of a growth equity than 100% buyout. And so growth equity is a little bit different. You don't buy 100% of the company typically, even though I think in AVG that might have been the case, or has it been close to that. And we actually analyzed in Benson Oak, what are the secrets to success in technology investing in Central Europe? Like, what made each exit successful, and what are the strategies? And by far the most prevalent one, the one we strive for, is pretty simple. It's called better be lucky than smart. There's the game of venture.
So a lot of antivirus guys were lucky in this region.
I guess so. Yeah. We're lucky people. What can I say? And it's very much true. Like, I think at the end of the day, luck is the underestimated factor in entrepreneurship. And that's why, for example, people who come from strategic consultancies sometimes have a hard time starting a high-risk startup because they apply a very intellectual and rational approach to company building and sort of discount the fact that over 50% of the success is probably luck. And so, we are in the business of trying to get lucky.
Okay. So are we going to have the startup pitch from someone? Just tell us your idea. Come on.
Okay, hello, good evening. My name is Wojciech Versek, and I'm the founder of Necestovka, which will in the global way become Taylor Flights. Here are a basic normal travel agencies that provide complete trips, like Thomas Cook, which just ended up early, and we have many flight ticket resellers here. We are, as a Taylor Flights and Necestovka, working between these two sectors. We want to provide complete tailor-made trips based on customers' experience and about the knowledge about his data. We built our made system, which I would say is similar to, for example, Amadeus at Esera, where we are collecting all the datas, and the customer creates his trip by his own. It means that you come to our website or to our future system that still doesn't exist, but hopefully will, and you choose your best flight, you choose your best accommodation, you choose your trip, you book your restaurant, you add the transfers, and you choose your trip on the exact ideas as you want. On the previous user experience, we would try to recommend you the services that you might be interested in, and that would ended up in the complete trip, which would be the best way of your life. That's it.
So my job is to give feedback on the idea, right? So first of all, like, big respect for being called out to present your business and coming on stage and presenting it. I would hate if somebody did that to me. And so I think you are in a right space with a lot of potential. At the end of the day, I think Airbnb experiences in many ways are moving the same direction. So I think it's definitely a vertical. So I think a lot of people are looking at how to bundle these services together, right? So somebody starts from accommodation, somebody starts from airplane ticket, somebody starts with ground transportation, and thinking about how can I increase that order basket. So I think that you have that right, and I think trend-wise you're correct. A lot of my questions, if we had more time, would focus on the scalability of it, meaning where do you get the data about the user which allows you to predict what is it that he wants in terms of a restaurant, in terms of a good hotel, and how much of that, how smart can you be about providing a unique experience, right? Like, I think where Airbnb has an unfair advantage is that based on your order history, on your accommodation, they can predict things you may like. Right, like if you're in a big house with a swimming pool suited for families, you probably want family-based. If you are in a small apartment downtown, you probably want a party. So I think it's interesting, and I would have a bunch of questions on sort of the scalability of the product, if it can be a product or if it's more of a service, which is sort of individually tailored for each customer. Is that helpful? And is that sort of what I was supposed to do?
Yeah, I think you did great, both of you.
Okay, all right, great.
Okay, thank you, Andrej.
Here, so
it was really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing all your insights. So we'll stay around. We'll have some snacks, and thank you for coming tonight. I hope you enjoyed it.